An awful lot gets blamed on the influence of feminism. Everyone from neo-Nazis on the Daily Storm to centre-left egalitarians like Sargon love to jump on the bandwagon. Feminism, the great Marxist evil of our age. If only we could find some way of defeating it. Honestly, I can't help but be reminded of the devout Christian who, after failing or perhaps willfully refusing to understand the concept of evolution, simply proclaims that God done it. I think to a lot of people, MRAs, libertarians, tradcons, Gamergate, neo-masculinists, and of course MGTOW as well, feminism represents a very convenient answer to a very complicated set of problems. Most of the comments critical of my last video about the gender attraction differential centered around my closing statement and the fact that I hadn't conclusively shown that the disparity was biological, that the gender differences we observe on these dating sites are modern and most easily explained by a century of cultural conditioning where women were taught to be entitled narcissists and men were taught that they are violent animals in constant need of checking their privilege. And yet, modern feminism, the catch-all answer, can't even begin to explain the ratio of female to male ancestry observed in our DNA, or the fact that chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, seem to show the very same sex selection ratios in their reproductive habits. For the sake of brevity and staying on topic, I quickly glossed over those facts at the end of my last video, but I think a more in-depth look at them may serve as a good starting point for this video. The screenshot that I quickly flashed up at the end of that video was this study on NCBI PubMed titled Male Dominance Rank and Reproductive Success in Chimpanzees, and it contains this table which lists the 23 observed male chimps featured in the study, ranked by the number of offspring they sired. Now, if we take that number of offspring to be a rough indication of that particular individual's attractiveness to the reproductively fit female chimps in the group, we can actually make a direct comparison between perceived attractiveness in male humans and in male chimpanzees. So let's plot this data against the graph I created in my last video that was based on OkCupid and Tinder statistics. Almost half the male chimpanzees didn't reproduce at all. Most of those who did only had a few offspring until we get to the alphas, with the number one chimp siring an impressive 7 offspring. Now, we're talking raw numbers of offspring, so what I'm going to do is normalize this graph by scaling the whole thing up, assuming that the top chimp who sired 7 offspring is basically seen by his female counterparts as a 10 on the chimpanzee hotness scale. He's basically our chimpanzee Ryan Gosling. I know I shouldn't be as surprised as I am by this, but it really is just fucking amazing, isn't it? That an approximated S-curve showing perceived attractiveness in human males based on modern online dating statistics from OkCupid and Tinder could so perfectly match the real-world unrestrained reproductive habits of our closest living primate relatives. It's so similar you'd almost think we were looking at the exact same data rather than two different, albeit related species. Just astounding. Now, on its face, the hereditary findings in human DNA don't seem like they tell us as much. Numbers like 2 to 1 often get thrown around, which is interesting in itself, but not terribly descriptive. However, if we look at one of the main studies that actually examines this data, which Stardust covered in his recent Neolithic hypergamy video, we see a much more interesting picture start to form. It's a fairly well-known fact that by tracking the propagation of certain hereditary mutations, we can actually map when certain human populations become geographically and therefore genetically isolated from each other. However, we can take this a step further. By comparing Y chromosomal drift against the hereditary mutations in mitochondrial DNA across those genetically diverse populations, as well as comparisons against our somewhat limited collection of ancient DNA samples, we can actually separate the population by gender and map the effective population size over time. Effective population size being the number of individuals who genetically contribute to the next generation, as seen in this graph from the study. Far more interesting than a simple 2-to-1 ratio, as the environment changes, such as it did during the Neolithic Revolution, we see the effective population ratio skew to a massive 17-to-1. For every 17 females having offspring, they are doing it with only one male. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, it's also worth noting the vertical scale on these graphs. I'm not exactly sure where this often cited 2-to-1 ratio actually comes from, because the graph scale measuring effective population size here is almost 3.5 times larger for women, across the entire timescale. Even at the graph's peak, for every 150 males siring offspring, more than 500 females are reproducing. I can't help but think the number should be more like 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1. Now, this is all very archaeological and impersonal. And if we want a clear first-hand look at these gendered reproductive trends unmarred by industrialisation or large-scale economies, there are in fact modern hunter-gatherers that we can actually observe today. Information on the rates and structure of hunter-gatherer intimate relationships are actually quite difficult to find, probably due to a range of factors from anthropology and sociology relying on politically correct ideals of the noble savage, to just the practical difficulties of observing remote primitive cultures without necessarily influencing them. In my own country, despite cultural changes over the last century, I know for a fact that traditional Aboriginal culture is polygynous. I've seen it firsthand, and it's even been the subject of feature-length films like 10 Canoes, which actually tells the story of a young hunter-gatherer who covets one of his older brother's 3 wives. I'd highly suggest anyone interested in these subjects check it out. It's a dramatisation rather than a documentary, but it gives a fantastic insight into the everyday lives of pre-colonial nomadic hunter-gatherers. However, most of the information I could find seems to be in the form of discussions by government and private welfare organisations about how this aspect of culture should be dealt with in the wider context of Australia, which legally defines marriage as one man to one woman. They note that polygyny is a component of traditional Aboriginal life, but they don't give anything in the way of actual rates, statistics, or even an explanation of tribal structure beyond the most basic description of kinship and skin names. Any actual studies on this aspect of Aboriginal life, if they exist, were basically impossible for me to find. I was, however, able to find this study on the Royal Society Open Science Journal titled Polygyny Without Wealth, Popularity in Gift Games Predicts Polygyny in Biyaka Pygmies, which contains some very relevant statistics and also mentions in the abstract some of the problems I've had finding this data. Quote, "The occurrence of polygynous marriage in hunter-gatherer societies which do not accumulate wealth remains largely unexplored since resource availability is dependent on male hunting capacity and limited by lack of storage. Hunter-gatherer societies offer the greatest insight to human evolution since they represent the majority of our species' evolutionary history." End quote. So the study's methodology basically involves the observation of an anonymous gift-giving game performed amongst several tribes. I guess you could think of this as the Stone Age hunter-gatherer version of Tinder. Unsurprisingly, the number of likes, in this case represented by honey sticks, don't fall on a linear distribution. Quote, "In 2 of the 3 camps where the gift game was played, the individual with the highest number of gifts was polygynous. Both of these men were the Kembetis, an appointed spokesperson of a camp of their respective camps. In Longa, this individual received 9 honey sticks compared to the camp male average of 2.6. Similarly, in Ibamba, these figures were 17 and 4.5 respectively." End quote. Okay, so like the chimpanzees earlier, I just want to normalise these raw honey stick numbers against my 0 through 10 scale of attractiveness, assuming that the top tribesmen of the Biyaka were considered the male 10s of their culture. Now, we can see there is some variation. it would appear that in the primitive communistic hunter-gatherer tribes, hypergamy is less pronounced, probably due to the only measurement of these tribal males being their subjective social capital. In modern times, with objective differences in accumulated financial capital, it seems much more pronounced. In times of transition between the two, such as the Neolithic period, where socially rich hunters are directly competing against resource-rich farmers, the reproductive ratio goes off the chart, so to speak. And of course, we always have to take reproductive comparisons between humans and other primates with a grain of salt. However, despite the variations, one thing remains absolutely consistent in every single one of these metrics, cross-culturally, cross-time period, and even cross-species with our primate cousins. The average male is naturally seen as below average by his female counterparts. Do we live in a cultural climate of man-hating, where men are seen as inherently less valuable than women? Well, yeah, I guess we do. But you have to understand that this so-called culture, how we all get along with each other and conduct ourselves as a large group, is really nothing more than a collective manifestation of our innate biological instincts. That is, we are innately wired at the individual level to see most men as less reproductively valuable than women, and as a result, that biological bias is simply compounded at the aggregate level as gynocentric culture. People seem to have this rosy idea that with enough activism and politicking and hard work, culture can be changed. But this culture rests on a firm foundation of biology. Trying to change the superficial online dating trends that we observe in modern society and, the less superficial social problems that flow on from that means first changing some very fundamental axioms of biological reproduction, which frankly goes beyond humans and even beyond the other great apes. I hate to say it, but if any MRAs are listening, this kind of cultural change is well beyond our means to control and will probably always remain so. This kind of consistency isn't just some arbitrary conditioning that we can be learned out of, and it certainly can't be explained away with a relatively recent Western political ideology. This is deeply biological and goes back to the days before we ever ventured out of Africa. With that statement, I could end the video right here, but I actually want to explore this gap between the biological and the ideological a little deeper. Now, you could potentially describe me as a biological determinist. As with the OkCupid statistics, I think most aspects of the human condition can ultimately be traced back to some kind of biological cause. And that has earned me a lot of accusations from detractors, both here on YouTube and elsewhere, that I overlook, diminish, or even wholesale ignore the importance and impact of culture, as well as the effects that specific political ideologies like feminism have on our everyday lives. And that's just not the case. I understand that these things are important. I understand that these ideological shibboleths like feminism and Black Lives Matter impact me personally on a daily basis. I really have to watch what opinions I divulge around certain people, especially at work. But you see, my interest here is not about personal struggles. It's about understanding the ultimate causes that drive the human species. My interest here is in trying to see the forest through the trees. The dense foliage of culture and the stinging insects of ideology are hard to see past when you are personally struggling through the jungle of life. And it's understandable. For the most part, people are focused on the obstacles directly in front of them. But if we can zoom out and see, for lack of a better term, God's point of view, we see that the dense forest only exists in the first place because of the rich tropical climate of that geographic region. Without the right soil and temperature and levels of precipitation, those trees wouldn't even be there. Without the trees, the animals wouldn't exist either, and so on. It's an entire ecosystem, and swatting at one of those ideological mosquitoes which lives in the swamp you're wading through is not going to make the tropical climate go away. I understand that culture and ideology affect each other, and as an inhabitant of the first world cultural jungle, I understand that these things ultimately affect me too. However, trying to remain as objective as possible, these things appear to exist as their own complete ecosystem too, and seem to be dependent on each other in a very specific hierarchical order with a very monodirectional flow of effect. Biology precedes culture, culture precedes ideology. See, it's rather telling to me that over our 10,000-year history of agrarian society and 5,000-year history of large-scale civilization, an organised movement of ideological feminism didn't happen until the last 150 years of industrialisation. After millennia of back-breaking pre-industrial labour, women didn't aggressively demand an equal place in the workforce until that meant moving from a comfortable couch to a comfortable office chair. And we see the exact same thing with the sexual revolution, or more accurately, the movement of female sexual empowerment. It didn't happen until birth control had already rendered the biological cost of such an empowerment movement completely null and void. Even today, women didn't demand a place at the video game table alongside us geeky, nerdy losers until we'd already grown it through dedication and hard work into a billion-dollar industry. Hell, growing up through the 90s, women and girls actively derided me for such hobbies. Then, once it starts to finally gain some mainstream traction and social acceptability, suddenly out of nowhere, you have all of these no-talent, ass-clown, indie wannabe developers like Zoe Quinn, who literally fucked her way to fame after making a shitty, flash-based text adventure addressing the goddamn United Nations about the so-called problem of misogyny on the internet. Everything about feminism strikes me as a reactionary movement. Its complaints, and more importantly its intended goals, are always several steps behind the immediate changes that are currently happening at the cultural and biological level. Biology, culture, ideology. The most coherent analogy I've been able to come up with to describe this framework is a computer system, where biology serves as the hardware, culture is the operating system that runs on that hardware, and ideology is the software that executes within the confines of that operating system. The operating system acts as something of a homogeneous translation layer that allows abstract software to talk to fixed hardware. These computing layers affect each other, but they do so in a very monodirectional and hierarchical order. You can't run the Apple version of Photoshop in the Windows operating system, and you can't run 64-bit Windows on 32-bit hardware. The transistor architecture of the hardware determines in a real physical way how the operating system must be compiled to run. And the operating system in turn determines through various APIs, link libraries and drivers how the higher level software talks to the lower level hardware in that environment. Hardware affects the OS and the OS affects the software, however, it doesn't really work the other way around. No software level patch out there is ever going to turn your 32-bit CPU into a 64-bit CPU. The physical hardware addressing just doesn't exist on that chip, and it's outside of the scope of digital software to make that physical change. The feminist movement really didn't change a whole lot. It's just a belief structure or collection of memes that grew from and capitalized on changes that had already happened. As a piece of ideological software, it could not have executed outside the cultural operating system of easier manual labour, made possible by the biological hardware upgrade of mechanization that happened during the Industrial Revolution. And likewise, feminism's subsequent software patches wouldn't have been possible had it not been for further biological hardware upgrades. In the same way that the latest games are limited by the processing power of hardware graphics cards, the success of these ideologies are ultimately decided by our biological limitations. Okay, so it's a nice enough analogy, but how does this idea of ideological software, cultural operating systems, and biological hardware ultimately translate into a real-world example? To show you, I've prepared something of a civilizational case study. What I've done is collect a whole bunch of graphs which track certain social variables over time in the United States. And what I want to do is overlay them with each other so that their timescales line up and we can see if there is any discernible patterns which emerge from the combined data. I think the best place to start would be divorce. Apart from the fact that it's a trend most people are already familiar with, I think it's a good place to start to set some of the basic parameters of our graph. Most of the social data collected seems to reliably start around the end of World War II. With divorce, we see a little bit of a rise at the end of the war, which I would say is probably the result of unworkable marriages that were hastily entered into by troops before being deployed, followed by a levelling off through the 50s, and then a truly massive rise through the 60s and 70s. Next, we'll add crime rates. Violent crimes, property crimes, and total crimes. Now, obviously, these are happening at different scales. Violent crimes are relatively rare, only a few dozen per 10,000 people. And total crime is necessarily going to be higher, being a combination of the other two. This doesn't really matter though. We don't really care about the vertical scale. What we care about is whether there is a broad correlation between the relative rates of these social variables along the same time scale. So what I'm going to do is normalize these graphs by vertically scaling them against each other. As you can see, there is an almost perfect correlation between divorce and all three crime metrics. Single motherhood is a little bit different. It starts off level with the others, begins to rise at the same rate as the others, but then it just keeps going up and up. Interestingly, no correlation with single fatherhood. Suicide, on the other hand, once again, an almost perfect fit. Without necessarily knowing the exact nature behind how all of these social variables are linked together, I think it's more than fair to say that there was a very broad and noticeable and consistent shift in the national culture of America at this particular time in the country's history. Now, this next graph is probably going to ruffle a few feathers, but it really does need to be addressed as part of this discussion, and that is government largesse. Based on this graph, there is no doubt that government expenditure as a percentage of the nation's GDP has steadily been growing over time. However, the social problems that we're examining here don't seem to be caused by or even vaguely correlate to this growing government largesse. Don't get me wrong, I'd love a smaller, more streamlined government. I'd love to cut a whole bunch of useless welfare and social programs so I could pay less tax. I'd especially love for rich politicians to be held accountable when they receive hundreds of thousands of tax dollars in travel expenses to essentially stay in their own fucking houses. In that sense, the libertarian goal of small government is a perfectly noble goal. But for all of this conspiratorial whispering about cultural Marxism, if we are going to be frankly honest about this situation we're in, government largesse is not the direct cause, and shrinking the government, if that's even possible, is not going to make these social problems go away. I know that's not what a lot of people want to be hearing, but, there's the data. So that really brings us to the ultimate question. What is the cause? Well, birth rates. In 1960, the birth control pill hit the market. The importance and impact of this little fun drug cannot possibly be overstated. This was literally a biological game changer, a chemical augmentation that allowed the human animal to indulge the base biological drive for sex without being automatically saddled with the biological cost of reproduction. It was a fundamental disruption to the evolutionary imperative. Almost immediately, the birth rate plummets into a state of absolute freefall. It is a perfect inverse correlation, with the other statistics like divorce rates trailing behind by a few years. By 1969, when Ronald Reagan first introduced no-fault divorce in the state of California, the national divorce rate had already skyrocketed and reached its maximum rate of exponential growth. By 1977, when universal no-fault divorce was implemented across the entire country, the divorce epidemic had basically already reached its peak. These changes to divorce law, which get blamed for just about everything, were frankly nothing more than a collection of reactionary political platitudes that simply codified what had already become the overwhelming cultural norm in America. What you are looking at here is the very core of my thesis. We see a biological change, followed by a cultural change, followed by an ideological change. And ideological feminism is no exception. It is completely reactionary. Its complaints and its ideological attitudes simply reflect the mainstream cultural environment of the day. In the late 50s and early 60s, it was Betty Friedan talking about women's place in a changing labour market, after they had already been put to work as part of the total war economy of the early to mid-40s. Germaine Greer published her famous Female Eunuch in 1970, reflecting an already established culture of female sexual empowerment. Valerie Solanas was slightly ahead of the curve with the Scum Manifesto in 1967. Although she was still clearly chronologically trailing behind rising divorce, crime and suicide rates. And despite being considered a radical at the time by her mainstream contemporaries like Friedan, she really served as a sign of things to come. By the late 70s and early 80s, the compounding cultural changes in divorce, reproduction, crime, suicide and single motherhood provided a cultural environment where no longer radical but rather mainstream feminism had flourished into a full-blown hate movement, with mainstream proponents like Andrea Dworkin and Susan Brownmiller proclaiming all men to be violent rapists. Fast forward another 30 years and here we are now. Thanks to the pandemic hysteria and slacktivist rallying campaigns afforded by instant online communication platforms like Twitter and Change.org, third-wave feminism, along with the rest of the modern social justice movement, are potentially crazier than all other social movements that have come before. But hopefully, you've already recognised the inherent problem. Making fun of, or even crafting serious exposés on individuals like Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian and Jonathan Butler is going to do absolutely fucking nothing to change the ubiquitous cultural environment in which these crazed ideologues flourish. Trying to change the ideological software is not going to change our cultural operating system. That would require the biological hardware upgrade to be physically uninstalled and put back into the birth control bottle, and that just isn't going to happen.